Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1 on somatic spinal reflexes. And this relates to one of your study questions in lecture unit 3. I like these cartoons, but jokes are always fun, right? So the one on the upper left, the doctor is trying to test his reflexes. Obviously, they're pretty good. The guy hit the ceiling. And in the bottom picture, again, a doctor's testing reflexes, and this time he gets kicked in the chin for it. And then the one on the right is kind of the funniest because there's a ninja guy in the background who's going to test the reflexes of this poor patient who doesn't know what's behind him. So, spinal reflexes. They have certain characteristics. They do require stimulation. They're not spontaneous, like they shouldn't happen without stimulation. So they're not spontaneous, but they are involuntary, meaning you can't with intention cause them to occur. So they're mediated by neurons in the spinal cord without any influence from the brain. The brain is not required. So it's an automatic response to a stimulus. They're very difficult to suppress. They also happen very quickly. Sometimes the movement in response to a stimulus happens and ends before your brain even realizes or is aware of the sensation. Like, for example, you can burn your fingers on a flame or the oven rack and withdraw your hands before you actually feel the pain. Another characteristic of a spinal reflex is that it is stereotyped. No matter when the stimulus occurs, each time the reaction will be the same way. It will occur, the motor reaction will occur the exact same way in response to the same stimulus. The spinal cord is the integration center for all the somatic reflexes that we'll talk about. A somatic reflex involves obviously some sort of sensory input to the skin or muscle tissue, and the motor component controls skeletal muscle. So these are considered somatic reflexes, not visceral reflexes. A visceral reflex is something that happens to smooth muscle or glands. So this is all somatic, voluntary skeletal muscle. The basic pathway of a spinal reflex is that first you have to have some sort of a receptor that detects the stimulus. And then there's a sensory neuron that carries the information to the spinal cord, and that sensory neuron is likely in a spinal nerve, unless, of course, it's in a cranial nerve, because some receptor is in your face, for example. The sensory neuron then travels to the spinal cord. Again, just to reiterate, in that dorsal or posterior root. And the spinal cord acts as an integration center. It contains interneurons that connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So you'll actually have a couple of synapses often, not always, but a couple of synapses, one from the sensory neuron to the interneuron, and then another from the interneuron to the motor neuron. Sometimes the sensory neuron directly synapses with the motor neuron. Then the motor neuron comes out the ventral root, travels in a spinal nerve, and goes to the last component of this spinal reflex, and that's the effector, which in our examples will always be a skeletal muscle. So this slide lists those 5 different components, and also in words, besides what I've said, in written words, describes exactly what each component does. So what's a somatic receptor? It's something that detects stimuli in the skin, muscle, or a tendon. A sensory neuron carries afferent information to the spinal cord. The integration center is the spinal cord, and with the help of interneuron connections, we'll send a signal to motor neurons. So a motor neuron is an efferent neuron that carries the impulse to a skeletal muscle. And then finally we have the effector, which is the skeletal muscle. We're going to look at two specific examples of somatic reflexes. One is a withdrawal reflex that we often experience with pain, and the other is called a crossed extensor withdrawal reflex, which is similar, but it's going to describe what happens to the opposite side of the body. So let's first just look at a simple withdrawal reflex. It's just like we looked at before. You have first a receptor that detects pain. Sensory neuron goes to the spinal cord. The spinal cord integrates information, sending out a signal to the motor neuron. The motor neuron goes to the effector, which in this case is the biceps brachii. The biceps brachii is a muscle in the upper arm that when contracts you bend your elbow. So that muscle is excited. There is another muscle that we'll learn in lab called the brachialis. It's not shown on this diagram, but it is also excited and performs the same action. So you bend your elbow effectively moving your hand away from whatever you've touched. Now at the same time, what has to happen is the antagonistic muscle needs to relax. So it is inhibited, and it will be part of this whole withdrawal reflex as well. It will be a different effector that's inhibited. So let's look at the circuitry a little bit for the antagonistic muscles. So this is the circuitry for the same reflex, the withdrawal reflex. And because of the presence of interneurons in the circuitry, we can get two motor neurons affected. Let's just say that, affected. So therefore, if you have two motor neurons affected, you've got the possibility of two muscles being affected. So in this example, what happens is that the person has touched something hot, and so that has been sensed by a receptor. The sensory neuron carries the information to the spinal cord, and here is an interneuron in white. Now the interneuron has two different axonal branches, one going to a black motor neuron, the other going to a blue motor neuron. One of the motor neurons will be excited and the other will be inhibited, which is perfect because the neuron that goes to the biceps brachii is causing the biceps brachii to contract, whereas the motor neuron that goes to the triceps is inhibited, making the triceps brachii inhibited. So that's how an interneuron in the spinal cord, or a series of interneurons, can result in two effectors being controlled. Now let's look at the crossed extensor withdrawal reflex. This is a little bit more complicated in terms of circuitry, but let's first look at let's look at what happens on the same side as the sensation first, okay? So in a crossed extensor reflex, on this right side of the body, sensory information has come in to the right side of the spinal cord, and with the help of interneurons, two motor neurons have been either stimulated or inhibited. One's probably stimulated, one's inhibited. The plus sign says stimulated, the negative sign says inhibited. So that's going to cause an action on the same side of the body. However, we want the opposite thing to happen on the other side of the body. This is particularly important when we're not talking about the arms, but we're talking about the legs, the lower limbs, because you want to maintain balance with one leg while you withdraw the other leg. So what we will have is a withdrawal reflex that's on the same side as the sensation. So we call that ipsilateral. But we want the opposite reaction on the opposite side. So contralateral. And we call this a contralateral extensor reflex. It means that you're going to bend one leg and stiffen the other, essentially. So before we look at exactly how this works, let's look at the muscles involved in bending the knee in the lower limb. Okay, so the muscles that are involved. We haven't done muscles yet. We're going to look at this biceps femoris muscle, one of the hamstring muscles. When it is excited and contracts, it causes the knee to bend or flex. So when it's excited, the knee bends. The quadriceps is an antagonistic muscle to the biceps. The quadriceps femoris is on the front, and when it's excited, it causes the knee to extend. You kick your leg out straight, right? So that's extension. So it would be this way. If instead the quadriceps femoris is inhibited, that muscle will relax. And then the biceps can take over and you can have bending of the knee. So let's look at what happens if you step on a piece of glass and have an automatic spinal reflex. So on the right side of the body, this right foot, this is kind of gruesome, steps on some glass. Pain is the stimulus. The sensory information goes into the spinal cord through a sensory neuron, and then two motor neurons are affected. On the right side of the body, the same side of the body, we want this knee to bend. So the biceps is excited. That's what the plus sign means. But the other motor neuron is inhibited. Therefore, the quadriceps is not stimulated. It relaxes. So in a sense, it's inhibited as well. So that's what's happening on the right side. You're bending the leg and the quadriceps relaxes and the hamstring contracts. And that's all because these two motor neurons, one is excited and one is inhibited. But think about what would happen if at the same time the spinal cord sent the same information over to the left side. You would fall down because you would bend both legs, right? So we need the spinal cord to reverse things on the opposite side. So let's look at what happens to the other side of the body, on the left side of the body. So on the right side, we still have the stimulus, and that comes into the spinal cord. And an interneuron crosses over to the opposite side of the spinal cord and affects two motor neurons. Those motor neurons are going to the same two muscles. One's going to the quadriceps, one's going to the biceps. But in this case, we need the one that's going to the quadriceps to be excited. We need it to be excited. So I think it's this one. It's excited, and the quadriceps contracts. You're stiffening your leg. And the biceps is not excited. So this motor neuron has been inhibited by the interneuron. And so you get a stiff leg on the left side, which is exactly what you want because you need to balance on your left leg. So in summary, a crossed extensor reflex that happens when you are experiencing a withdrawal reflex is that the withdrawal reflex happens on the same side as the stimulus. So in this case, the withdrawal is going to happen on the right side, and that involves flexion of the knee, bending of the knee. But on the opposite side, you get an extensor reflex. So it's still a reflex, it's still automatic, but it's crossed onto the other side of the body. On the left side of the body, you get extension. And this is all mediated because there are separate neurons going to the two muscles involved with flexion and extension. When the right leg withdraws, it's flexing. When the left leg reacts, it's extending. And that's what a crossed extensor reflex is. Pretty amazing circuitry. Thank you very much. That's the end of this lecture.